I had been camping alone for years, but the trip I took in the summer of 2019 still sits in my mind like a weight I can't shake. I was 28 back then, living in Oregon, and I had this habit of driving out to different states whenever life felt too loud. That July, I aimed for northern Idaho, somewhere quiet, somewhere with thick forests, long dirt roads, and enough isolation that I could hear my own heartbeat at night. I didn't expect anything strange. I didn't even expect to stay long. I just wanted to get away from screens, people, and noise. I drove for hours until the paved roads died out and the trees closed in around me. Tall pines pressed against the sky. The air got colder, and the sunlight felt thinner. I found a spot off a narrow dirt road, maybe 40 minutes past the last tiny town. It wasn't an official site, just a rough clearing with a fire ring made from old rocks. That kind of place always made me feel calm. Felt untouched, forgotten, simple. I parked my truck, turned off the engine, and let the silence settle. Felt like stepping into another world. The only sounds were the soft ticking of my cooling engine and the far-off hum of insects. I set up my tent near a fallen log and put my food in a bag inside my truck. I like to keep things neat. It made the forest feel less like a threat and more like a space I knew how to control. The first evening was peaceful. I walked around the area, checking the trees, the ground, the slope of the land. I liked knowing my surroundings. The forest floor was thick with needles and damp soil. The air smelled like sap and old wood. A small stream ran about 100 yards behind my camp, slow-moving and shallow. When the light faded, I made a small fire and sat there for hours, listening to the crackling and feeling the heat on my face. I didn't think about anything important. I just watched the flames twist and fall apart. I slept well that night. The forest was quiet. I woke up early the next morning, stretched, ate a simple breakfast, and decided to hike deeper into the woods. I didn't bring much, just water, a knife, some snacks. I followed the stream for a while, moving uphill, stepping over fallen branches and rocks. The air had that cold mountain feeling even in the summer. Everything felt normal, calm, almost safe. But around noon, something changed. It wasn't dramatic. It was small, so small it almost felt stupid to notice, but the woods got quiet in a strange way. Not the usual peaceful silence. This was a pressured kind of quiet, like the air itself was waiting for something. I couldn't hear birds anymore. I couldn't hear insects. Even the breeze felt thin. At first, I thought maybe I imagined it. Maybe I walked into an area with fewer animals. But as I kept going, that quiet followed me, stuck to me like a shadow. I tried to shake the feeling by focusing on the trail I was cutting through the brush, but the hairs on my arms stayed raised. About 2 hours into the hike, I noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. A tree trunk had a long, fresh scrape down the side. It wasn't a claw mark, too smooth. It looked like something sharp had dragged against it recently. The wood underneath was pale and raw. I crouched down and looked closer. It wasn't weathered at all. Whatever made that mark did it not long before I arrived. I tried to tell myself hunters sometimes dragged equipment or metal against trees, but the angle didn't make sense. It ran too high, almost shoulder height on me. I stood there for a minute, staring at it, feeling the forest pressing in around me again. I kept hiking, but I moved slower, more careful. I kept glancing over my shoulder even though I saw nothing but the same endless pattern of trees. After another half hour, I found the second sign. A small piece of cloth was stuck on a branch, a ripped bit of faded green fabric, like from an old jacket. It fluttered lightly even though the air barely moved. It looked out of place, wrong. It made my stomach tighten because there was no reason for it to be there, snagged so cleanly. I didn't want to keep going, but turning back felt worse, like whatever was causing those signs would be behind me the whole walk back. But I couldn't stay out there all day, so I finally forced myself to return to camp. Every few steps, I felt the urge to look around. The forest still didn't make a sound. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was dropping. The air had cooled fast. I built another fire and tried to relax, but my nerves were tight. I kept noticing little things. The slight movement of bushes when there was no wind. The feeling that something was past the tree line watching me. The shift of shadows that didn't match the firelight. When the sky turned dark, the quiet grew thicker. Usually nights in the woods are full of noises. Rustling, distant calls, insects. But that night sounded hollow. I sat by the fire, staring into the trees. The longer I stared, the harder it was to tell if I was seeing shapes or just imagining them. My mind kept replaying the scrape on the tree, the piece of cloth. I tried to shake the feeling, but it sat deep in my chest, heavy and cold. Hours passed. The fire burned low. I should have gone to sleep, but something in me refused. I felt exposed, like closing my eyes would let something step closer. I kept adding small sticks to keep the flames alive. I couldn't see far beyond the light, but I sensed movement out there, subtle and slow. Around midnight, I heard it. Not loud, not sudden, just a soft, steady sound of twigs breaking in a pattern that matched footsteps. Human footsteps, heavy enough to break dry sticks, slow enough to be deliberate. My entire body froze. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The steps didn't come straight toward me. They circled, always just at the edge of the darkness, always staying hidden. Whoever or whatever it was knew I couldn't see them. They took their time, never rushing. It felt like they were studying the camp, studying me. I sat there for what felt like hours, muscles shaking, hands sweaty. The footsteps faded eventually, drifting deeper into the forest. I didn't sleep at all. I waited for dawn like it was a lifeline. When the sunlight finally touched the tops of the trees, I packed my things faster than I ever had in my life. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped half my gear. I kept scanning the woods, expecting to see someone standing there, watching, but nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. As I loaded the last of my bags into the truck, I noticed something that froze me completely. In the soft dirt behind my tent, near the spot where I'd walked back and forth all night, there were footprints. Not mine, larger than mine, deep, fresh. They led from the trees straight toward my tent, stopping just a few feet from where my head had been while I sat awake. Then they turned and backed away into the woods. My throat tightened as I stared at them. They were real, not imagined. Someone had walked right up to my camp in the middle of the night, close enough to reach me if they wanted. They hadn't spoken. They hadn't revealed themselves. They had just watched. I got into my truck and drove away without looking back. The farther I went, the more sound returned to the world. Birds, insects, wind. But my heartbeat didn't settle. Even when I reached the highway, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached home hours later, I sat in the driveway and didn't move for a long time. The forest smell was still on my clothes. The image of the footprints wouldn't leave my mind. I knew they were real. I knew someone was out there in those woods, moving quietly, watching people who didn't know they were being watched. I still camp sometimes, but never alone. Never in places without other people nearby. And whenever I wake up at night to some rustling in the trees or a stick snapping in the dark, I can't help but picture those footprints behind my tent, and the silent way whoever made them had walked around me for hours. I tell myself it was just some hiker, maybe a hunter, maybe someone lost, but the truth is simpler and harder to accept. Someone had chosen my campsite that night, not by accident, not by mistake, but with purpose. I will never know what they wanted or why they crept so close without showing themselves. But I know one thing with absolute clarity after that trip to Idaho. The scariest thing in the wilderness isn't nature. It's the people who know how to hide in it. I went camping alone in northern New Mexico in late October of 2019. I was 26 at the time, and I had been trying to get away from screens, noise, and my busy routine. I picked a quiet spot near the edge of the Carson National Forest, a place I had only seen once on a map. The land there felt wide and empty, with long stretches of pines, open clearings, and dry ground that cracked under my boots. The air smelled sharp, like cold dirt and old wood. The sky looked endless even during the day. I parked my truck on a patch of flat dirt off a service road that barely looked used. The tires sank a little into the soft ground, and the sound of cooling metal popped in the quiet. I remember thinking how far away I was from everything. No cars, no other camps, no houses. Just silence and this dry wind that kept brushing past me like it had something to say. I set up my tent near a crooked pine tree with branches that twisted sideways as if they were reaching for something. I placed my food in a locked container inside the truck, checked the straps on my pack, and then walked a small loop around the area just to get familiar with the space. The dirt looked old and untouched, except for a few deep hoof prints that didn't match the size of deer. They were wider, almost rounder, like someone had stepped hard into the soil with a heavy heel. I didn't think much of it, telling myself the ground out here distorted prints easily. As the sun lowered, I set up a small fire using dry sticks I gathered. The flames looked weak at first, then grew stronger as I fed it thicker pieces. The orange glow felt comforting. My tent looked tiny in the dim light, the canvas shaking a little every time the wind swept across the clearing. I ate a simple meal, sitting on a folded blanket inside my tent doorway, watching the fire settle into red coals. The smell of smoke stuck to my clothes and hair. When the light finally disappeared, everything dropped into darkness fast. Not city darkness, not backyard darkness, just a deep, heavy black where shapes disappeared completely. My fire was the only thing that held back the night, and even that felt small. I sat inside my tent after putting out the fire, listening to the fabric shift and the wind tug at the seams. It took a long time for my breathing to settle enough for sleep. I woke up sometime after midnight. I didn't know what time exactly, but the air felt colder, and the darkness seemed even heavier. What woke me wasn't a sound, but a feeling, like pressure in the atmosphere, the same way the air feels right before a storm. My stomach tightened for no reason. I lay very still on my sleeping pad and listened. At first, there was nothing but the faint rustling of branches. Then I heard movement. It wasn't far. Came from the tree-line behind my tent. Slow steps, something heavy pressing the ground in a steady pattern. I held my breath without meaning to. The steps weren't smooth like a deer or quick like a coyote. They were spaced strangely, slow, uneven, almost as if something was adjusting its weight with each move. The sound grew clearer in the cold air. Dry leaves shifted. A twig snapped. Then another. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. Something about the rhythm of the footsteps felt wrong. I stayed still, counting each heavy step, and then everything went quiet again. The sudden silence felt even worse. I didn't want to unzip the door or shine my light outside. I didn't want to make a single sound. Then I heard breathing. It was faint at first, almost lost in the wind, but it grew clearer. It wasn't the kind of breathing that came from an animal with a snout. It sounded rougher, more strained, almost like someone trying to breathe through a dry throat. The breathing came from the opposite side of the tent, the side I couldn't see. I froze completely. I could picture something standing just a few feet from me, but I couldn't understand how something so large had moved around the tent so silently. The breathing grew slower, as if whoever or whatever stood there was listening for something inside the tent. The fabric moved slightly, only a few inches, like wind had pushed it, except there was no wind at that moment. My pulse hammered so fast I could hear it in my ears. The breathing stopped suddenly. Then the footsteps returned, but this time they moved away, fading deeper into the trees. They kept the same strange, uneven rhythm. Heavy, then light, then heavy again, as if something walked on feet that didn't move the same way. It took a long time before I convinced myself to move. When I finally grabbed my flashlight, my hand shook so badly that the beam trembled. I didn't unzip the tent until the sky started to brighten with early morning light. The moment I stepped outside, the air smelled sharp and cold. I scanned the clearing, the ground, the trees. Everything looked normal until I saw the prints. They weren't far from the tent, maybe 3 feet. The shape wasn't round like before. It looked like the print of a bare foot, but twisted. The heel was deep, almost like something had pressed down hard. The front half spread wide as if the toes were splayed unnaturally far apart. The shape didn't look human. It didn't look animal. It looked wrong, like something moving in a way it shouldn't. The prints circled the tent once, then disappeared into the trees. I stayed out there for a while, staring at them, trying to ignore the tight feeling in my chest. My first thought was that someone had tried to scare me, maybe a hunter or someone living off the land in these woods. But there was something in the prints that didn't match that. The spacing between them was long, almost too long for a normal stride. And the way some prints were deep while others barely touched the soil made me think of someone dragging their weight strangely. The longer I studied the ground, the more uneasy I felt. The silence around me didn't help. No birds, no rustling, nothing but still, cold air. I packed up faster than I ever have in my life. I threw my sleeping bag into the back of the truck, pulled down my tent without folding it properly, and kept looking toward the trees every few seconds. I kept feeling like something was watching me, not out of curiosity, but out of patience, like it knew I wasn't staying. When I finally got into the truck, my hands were stiff and cold. I locked the doors even though I knew how pointless that was in an open forest. The engine sounded too loud as it started, echoing through the trees. As I drove off the service road, I checked the rearview mirror again and again. I never saw anything move between the trees, but every shadow looked like something leaning forward, watching. When I reached the main road, I finally breathed out. The tension in my chest eased just enough for me to realize how tightly I had been gripping the wheel. My knuckles were white. The sky had brightened fully, but the morning light didn't comfort me the way I expected. I felt like something had followed me all the way out until the forest ended. When I got home later that day, I searched online for explanations. Large animals with deformed limbs, bears walking strangely, people living isolated in the woods. Nothing matched the shape of those prints or the way that thing breathed outside my tent. The closest thing I found were old stories people shared about strange figures in wooded areas. Stories passed down for generations. Stories about something that looked human but wasn't, something that copied the way people moved but never perfectly. Something people only whispered about. I didn't believe any of those stories before. I'm not sure I even believe them now. All I know is what I heard, what I felt, and what I saw that morning. I've gone camping many times in my life, but I've never gone back to that side of New Mexico. I haven't camped alone since either. The prints stayed in my mind for weeks. The shape, the size, the strange spreading of the toes. The sound of that slow breathing still comes back to me sometimes when I'm lying awake at night. I try to convince myself it was just an injured animal or someone passing through the woods. But deep down, I know it wasn't normal. It wasn't familiar. It wasn't right. The worst part is the thought that keeps returning to me. The thought I can't shake no matter how much time passes. Whatever walked around my tent that night wasn't just passing through. It came close because it wanted to understand me. It stopped breathing because it wanted to listen. And it walked away only because it decided not to do anything more. Not yet. I tell myself I left before it changed its mind. I had picked a lonely stretch of national forest in northern Idaho for the trip, far from the usual campgrounds and weekend crowds. It was late September, just at the edge of the season when the nights began to feel sharp and unfriendly. I was 31, used to camping alone, and usually found peace in the silence of isolated places. I had brought simple gear, an old green tent, a sleeping bag that carried the smell of past trips, a heavy flashlight, and enough food for 3 nights. The plan was simple. Stay off the main trails, set up near a small lake I had seen on maps, and spend a few days away from everything. Rain started long before I found a flat spot, which made the ground soft under my boots. By late afternoon, the trees were dripping like they had been sweating all day. I found a clearing slightly above the lake, not too close to the waterline, but close enough that I could see its dark surface through the gaps in the trees. The sky had that dull gray look that made it impossible to tell where the clouds ended and the mountains began. My clothes stuck to my skin as I set up the tent, the fabric catching the wind and slapping my hands every time I tried to pull it tight. The forest felt heavier in the rain, like everything smelled stronger. Mud, pine, and the earthy scent that rises when wet leaves rot. By the time I finished setting up, the rain had turned into a steady sheet. The air felt cold enough to see my breath at times. The forest around me blurred into dark outlines, and the lake looked like something painted in deep ink. I ate a quick dinner, sitting under a small tarp I had tied between 2 bent trees. My boots were soaked, and every sound, every drip, every gust, seemed louder than it should have been. That was always the strange thing about camping alone in rain. The noise never stopped, not for a second, and it messed with the sense of what was close and what was far. As the sky darkened, I got this uneasy feeling that something was off. Not supernatural, not anything like that. Just the quiet instinct that maybe I had picked a place too far off the beaten path. I couldn't shake the thought that no one would come out here unless they had a reason to avoid people. I tried to push the thought aside. It was only rain, only a lonely night, nothing unusual. I climbed into the tent as the forest slipped into full darkness. The sound of the rain hitting the thin roof became a constant hiss. I lay on my back, staring at the dim outline of the tent ceiling, feeling the cold air seeping through the fabric. The rain made it hard to tell if anything was moving outside, and that bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Every shift in the wind felt like footsteps. Every heavier drop of rain felt like it came from something brushing against the tent. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Hours passed, though it was impossible to know how many. My flashlight sat near my hip, the only comfort in the darkness. The forest had a strange rhythm that night. The rain would swell, crash harder on the tent, then fall into a softer pattern. My ears kept trying to pick out anything different, any sound that didn't match the rain. Eventually, something did. It was faint, almost hidden, but it was there. A soft thud of weight on wet ground. Then another. Slow, not rushing, not stumbling. Just footsteps, steady and confident. They didn't get closer at first. They just moved somewhere nearby, behind the trees, like someone walking a careful circle around the camp. I lay still, trying to tell myself it was a deer, maybe an elk. But the steps were too deliberate, too spaced, and too heavy for that. I felt my chest tighten, the kind of fear that doesn't come from panic, but from slow realization. The steps paused. The rain filled the silence. Then a new sound drifted through, a long scrape, like something being dragged across wet earth. My breathing turned shallow. I gripped the flashlight without turning it on. I didn't want the beam to give away exactly where I was inside the tent. The dragging sound stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but rain. I waited, not moving, barely blinking. Then something pressed lightly against the side of my tent. Not a strike, not a grab, just the faintest touch, enough to push the fabric inward an inch. I felt the pressure move slowly along the wall, like a hand gliding across it. The hair on my neck prickled so hard it hurt. My body wanted to jump up, but my mind told me that staying still was safer. The pressure disappeared. A few heartbeats later, the footsteps came back, but this time they moved farther away, still nearby, still aware of me, but now pacing somewhere just beyond the reach of my light. I stayed awake, keeping my ears focused on every sound, the tent feeling smaller by the minute. The fear wasn't loud. It was suffocating, patient, the type that builds because you know someone or something is watching and waiting. At some point, the footsteps stopped completely, and that was almost worse. I couldn't hear anything but rain and wind. My eyes stayed open for hours, staring at the faint movement of the wet fabric swaying. The night dragged on so long it felt endless. Eventually, I drifted into a light sleep, more like passing out from exhaustion than actually resting. When I woke, the tent was faintly lit by early morning gray. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest silent in that eerie way it gets after a night storm. My body felt stiff, and a layer of cold dampness had settled over everything. I unzipped the tent slowly, letting the smell of wet pine hit me first. The clearing looked different under daylight, less threatening, but still strange. The ground around the tent was covered in footprints. They were human, barefoot. The mud held the shape clearly. Long, narrow impressions with toes pressed deep. Whoever had walked around my tent had circled it more than once. There were also long marks where something had been dragged, a branch or maybe a piece of gear. The prints weren't tiny, but they weren't oversized either. Just ordinary adult feet, which somehow made it worse. There was nothing supernatural about this. Someone had been out here in the rain, walking barefoot in the cold, and had decided to come right up to my tent in the middle of the night. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. I scanned the trees, looking for movement. Nothing. No sounds. No sign of anyone. I checked my gear. Everything was still there, but a few yards away I found a thin, freshly cut branch with its end sharpened to a point. It had mud on one side, like it had been dragged. I didn't waste time packing. I shoved everything into my backpack, half-zipped the straps, and tore down the tent without checking if I was folding it right. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the forest still held the cold bite of the night. I kept looking over my shoulder as I walked, ears tuned for any sound behind me. Every shadow between the trees made me speed up a little more. The hike back to my truck felt like the longest walk of my life. The rain had turned the trail into a slippery mess, but I didn't stop. Not until I reached the gravel road where I had parked. The truck looked exactly how I had left it. Cold, wet, and lonely in the gray light. I threw my gear into the back and got in, locking the doors the second I sat down. When the engine started, that sound was the first thing all night that felt like safety. I drove until I reached the highway, and only then did the fear start to loosen its grip. But the uneasiness never fully left. Even now, I think about those footprints, the clear bare ones circling my tent, the slow, steady steps in the rain, the hand-like pressure pushing the fabric inward. Someone had been out there, close enough to touch me through the thin wall of nylon. Someone had walked barefoot through cold rain in the middle of nowhere, watching me for hours without saying a word. I never went back to that lake, and I don't camp alone in deep forests anymore. Not because of ghosts or monsters or anything like that, but because the most frightening thing I've ever felt came from another human being. One I never saw, but who came far too close in the darkness of a rainy night, with nothing but a thin tent layer between us. I drove out to a quiet stretch of woods in northern Wyoming in the late summer of 2019, a place I had only visited once before on a short hike. I had been working too many hours back then, and I needed a break from everything: noise, traffic, people, screens, all of it. I packed my small tent, a sleeping bag, a knife I always kept in the glove compartment, a flashlight, 2 extra batteries, and enough food and water for 2 nights. I wanted peace, and out there, I expected nothing but wind in the trees and the smell of dry pine needles. The road leading to the clearing where I planned to set up camp was rough, full of small dips and rocks that made my old SUV rattle each time I went over them. The sun was still up, but a layer of orange haze had formed on the western horizon, reminding me that night wasn't far off. When I parked, the air was dry and still, the kind of stillness that makes you stand quiet for a moment because you don't want to disturb it. I walked around, picking a spot under a tall pine tree where the ground was mostly flat and not covered in sharp stones. As I pitched the tent, a faint smell of smoke drifted by. It wasn't campfire smoke, more like an old smell, something carried from far away by the wind. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone else. No vehicles, no footsteps, no sound of branches snapping under boots. Nothing. I pushed it aside, thinking maybe it was from some distant cabin or maybe even from a small wildfire that the rangers already knew about, because things like that were common in the dry months. After setting everything up, I walked further out to explore before the daylight disappeared. The forest floor was covered with brown needles, small pine cones, and rough patches of dirt. The woods stretched far into the distance with the trees spaced enough that you could see ahead but still feel closed in. I kept wandering until the sky started dimming and a cold breeze swept through the branches. The temperature dropped quicker than I expected. I turned back, feeling that tiredness in my legs that comes after a long day, and I looked forward to a quiet night in the tent. By the time I got back to camp, the sky had gone a dull blue-gray. I sat on a log I had dragged over and ate a simple meal, listening to the cold wind push through the tops of the trees. The stillness was more intense after the sun went down. The woods felt heavier at night, as if every dark shape hid something. I tried to relax. That was the whole point of coming here, to calm down, not spin myself up with thoughts. Around an hour into the darkness, I noticed something strange. While I was adjusting the zipper on the tent, I felt like there was movement far beyond the trees on my right side. Something faint, but enough to pull my attention. I stood still, trying to see through the darkness. My flashlight was on the log, but I didn't want to grab it yet. I listened, but the wind had quieted, and there was no sound now. My heartbeat started to speed up. I kept looking until my eyes hurt from staring into nothing. I forced myself to sit back down and breathe. The woods play tricks on people. Shadows move even when nothing is there. But that tight feeling in my chest didn't go away. I finished eating and put all my food inside a small metal box I brought to keep animals away. The moment I fastened it shut, a sudden crack echoed through the trees. Something stepping on a branch. Not an animal scurrying. Not a small snap. It was heavy, slow, intentional. I felt my throat tighten. I grabbed the flashlight and didn't turn it on. I just held it, waiting, bracing myself. I stood behind my tent. I waited for another sound, but none came. Everything went silent again. Too silent. After a while, I crawled inside the tent. I zipped it up slowly, trying not to make much noise. I laid down, staring at the thin nylon above me. The wind had stopped completely. I kept replaying the sound in my head. A person steps differently than an animal. A person puts weight differently. The sound had too much pressure in it. Too much weight for a deer or even a large animal. Sleep didn't come easy. Every few minutes, my eyes would shut. Then I'd jerk awake again. The ground felt colder than it usually did, and even inside the sleeping bag, I felt tense. At one point, around what I guessed was past midnight, I heard a soft dragging sound somewhere outside. It wasn't metal. It wasn't a branch. It sounded like fabric brushing along the forest floor or something being pulled slowly, like a foot sliding when someone doesn't lift their leg properly. My body froze. I didn't move a muscle. I kept my breathing as quiet as I could, trying to figure out what direction the sound came from. It stopped suddenly, leaving me with that electric feeling of fear that spreads through your chest and makes your fingers cold. Minutes passed. Nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to sleep. When I woke up early the next morning, the sunlight was weak and pale. I stepped out of the tent and scanned the clearing. My chest tightened when I saw the ground. To the right of my tent, maybe 15 feet away, there were footprints in the dirt. They weren't animal tracks. They were the shape of boots, uneven, with one foot dragging slightly behind the other, leaving a long smear in the soil. I felt a heavy chill go down my spine. Someone had been standing near my camp in the night. Someone had walked around without saying anything, without making themselves known. Someone had stopped close enough to my tent that I should have heard breathing if I hadn't been asleep. The footprints came from deeper in the woods, wandered around the edge of my clearing, circled my tent once, then disappeared back the way they came. I looked at the trees in that direction, feeling suddenly watched. I packed my gear slower than I probably should have because I was trying to stay calm. I kept looking over my shoulder again and again, expecting to see someone standing there. I decided I wouldn't stay a second night. I didn't care why the person had been there. Everything about it felt wrong. The dragging step, the silence, the fact they walked around my tent instead of passing by. I stuffed everything into the back of my SUV and slammed the door shut. The sound echoed too loudly, bouncing off the trees. As I started the engine, I saw something in the far distance between the tree trunks. A shape, tall, motionless, person. They stood with one shoulder slightly dropped, like they were leaning or injured. Their head was tilted down, and even though I couldn't see the face, I knew they were looking toward me, not moving, not turning away, just watching. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. I drove out of there faster than I should have on such a rough road. The whole time, I kept checking the rearview mirror, seeing only the dusty trail rising behind me. No figure following, but that didn't calm me. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. My heartbeat felt sharp in my chest. Even miles away from that place, I could still see the shape in my mind. I could still imagine that dragging step moving closer to my tent while I slept, knowing someone was out there circling around me with no purpose that made sense. When I finally reached the highway, I pulled over and sat there for a long time with the engine running, breathing hard, trying to steady myself. I felt embarrassed for feeling so shaken, but fear doesn't care about pride. The truth was simple. Someone had been out there in the woods with me, walking around in the dark, moving silently, dragging one foot like their leg was injured or stiff, watching the only camp in that clearing. I never went back to that part of Wyoming again. I still don't know what that man wanted, why he wandered around my tent, or what he planned to do if I had stepped outside. But I do know one thing clearly, as clear as the moment I saw him between the trees. He wasn't lost. He wasn't curious. He had been standing there on purpose, and he had been watching me long before I ever noticed him. I think about that dragging step sometimes, especially at night. The way the sound moved slowly, with patience, like the person knew they had all the time in the world. And every time I remember it, the same thought comes back. If I hadn't woken up when I did, or if I had stayed another night, I don't think I would have ever found out what he really wanted. I think he would have shown me. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it was 10 years ago. It was the summer of 2015, and I was 27. My dog, a golden retriever named Cooper, was with me, and I decided to take a solo camping trip into the mountains of western Montana. I needed some time away from the city, away from people, away from everything, and I thought the woods would give me that peace. I'd been camping plenty of times before, but this trip felt different from the start, even as I loaded my gear into my old Toyota Tacoma. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already leaning toward the horizon. The trailhead was quiet, almost unnaturally quiet, with only the faint sound of wind brushing through the pine needles. Cooper was restless as soon as I opened the truck door. He sniffed the air, ears perked, tail wagging, but there was a tension in him too, a kind of unease I hadn't seen in him before. I shrugged it off as excitement. Dogs always got anxious in new places. I followed a narrow dirt path into the forest, hiking for about 2 hours until I found a small clearing by a creek. The creek wasn't much, just a trickle of water running over smooth stones, but it was enough to justify setting up camp. I pitched my small, olive green tent and stacked some firewood nearby. Cooper wandered along the edge of the clearing, sniffing and marking the trees, but he kept glancing back at me, almost like he was warning me about something I couldn't see. As night fell, I lit a fire, the flames casting dancing shadows across the clearing. The smell of wet earth mixed with the smoke, and the occasional snap of a branch in the distance reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone. I fed Cooper and set up my sleeping bag, thinking I'd be fine. But as darkness settled in, the forest seemed to come alive in a way that was impossible to ignore. Every rustle of leaves, every distant crack, sounded amplified, and Cooper refused to lie down, pacing in circles around the tent. Around midnight, I started hearing it, a low, scraping noise from deeper in the forest. At first, I thought it was just the wind brushing against fallen branches, but then I realized it was rhythmic, deliberate, like something dragging itself across the ground. Cooper stiffened, hackles raised, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. My heart rate spiked. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam through the trees. Nothing, only shadows. The scraping stopped for a while, but then it started again, closer this time. Cooper began barking, sharp and frantic. I grabbed my small camping knife and shone the flashlight toward the noise. That's when I saw movement. Just a shadow low to the ground, weaving between the trees, moving unnaturally fast. My breath caught in my throat. I told myself it was probably a deer or a bear, but my gut said otherwise. The way it moved was wrong, not like any animal I'd ever seen. Cooper barked again, louder this time, and darted toward the tree lean, growling ferociously. I ran after him, flashlight shaking in my hands. He disappeared into the dark trees, and I followed, tripping over roots and rocks. Then I saw it clearly just for a second. A figure, hunched and moving with terrifying speed, darted between the trees, following Cooper. My mind screamed at me to grab him and run, but I froze for a moment, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. It wasn't a person. Not really. It was something wrong. Cooper's bark turned into a high-pitched whine, and then silence. My stomach dropped. I ran faster, calling his name, my voice shaking in the cold night air. Then I heard a faint yelp, followed by another bark, relief mixed with fear. I followed the sound and found Cooper tangled in some low branches, growling at a shadow just beyond the edge of the moonlight. I didn't see it clearly, but I saw enough. Eyes reflecting the flashlight beam, low and menacing, and a figure crouched unnaturally, too tall to be an animal but too wild to be human. I grabbed Cooper, pulling him out of the branches, and ran back toward the clearing as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was back by the tent, slamming the flap closed and grabbing my fire poker. I lit the fire again, piling on logs until the flames roared. Cooper huddled at my side, shaking, but alert, eyes locked on the tree lean. The scraping and rustling had stopped, but I knew it hadn't gone far. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound made me jump. Cooper refused to lie down and stayed close, ears pricked, growling at shadows that I couldn't see. By morning, I was exhausted, but daylight brought some comfort. The forest looked normal again, peaceful even, with sunlight filtering through the trees and birds chirping. I packed up as fast as I could, keeping an eye on the treeline the whole time. Cooper stayed alert, refusing to let his guard down. On the way back to the truck, I found signs that confirmed my fear. Deep claw marks gouged into tree trunks, tufts of dark fur caught on branches, and footprints that were neither human nor entirely animal. My stomach churned, but I kept moving. I didn't look back until I was miles down the road, finally able to relax in the safety of my vehicle. Cooper licked my face, exhausted but alive, and I hugged him tightly, promising him silently that we would never come back to this forest. Even now, years later, I can't explain what I saw. People have told me it was a bear, maybe a large cat, or even just my imagination fueled by isolation and fear. But I know what I saw. The way it moved, the way it watched us, it wasn't natural. And Cooper's behavior confirmed it. He's a calm, loving dog, but that night he acted like he was facing something truly dangerous. I still go camping, but never alone, and never in Montana. I've learned to respect the signs animals give you, to trust your gut even when logic tells you nothing is there. That night changed the way I see the woods, the way I see silence, and the way I see shadows. I still hear the faint sound of scraping in my dreams, the sound of something watching, always just beyond the light. And I know if I ever return to those mountains, I would not be alone, and neither would Cooper. I went hunting alone in the fall of 2018, deep in the northern woods of British Columbia. I was 31 at the time, feeling confident enough to take a weekend trip without anyone joining me. I had been hunting since my early 20s, and I liked the stillness of the trees. The slow way time moved in the forest, the heavy smell of pine and cold soil. I had taken time off work, packed my old truck with gear, and driven hours away from the nearest town. Felt good to leave everything behind. It always did. I reached the area late in the afternoon, a place I had only visited once before. It wasn't an official campsite, just a small clearing close to a dried-out riverbed. The air had a sharp chill in it, the kind that sits lightly on the skin but brings a warning that night will feel colder. The sun was sinking fast, making the tree line look like a dark wall. I set up my small tent, unpacked my supplies, and walked around the clearing to stretch my legs after the long drive. The forest around me looked untouched, dense, quiet, and thick with fallen needles. It felt peaceful, and for a while, that peace made me forget how isolated I really was. I planned to hunt early the next morning, so I ate a simple meal, checked my gear, and crawled into my tent just as the sky turned purple. The first night passed without anything strange. I woke up a little before sunrise, the cold, thin air stinging my nose, and went out to start the day. I moved slowly and quietly, watching the faint shapes of trees as the sky brightened. The forest felt empty, almost too empty. I didn't hear the usual rustling or distant animal calls I expected in the early morning. It didn't worry me at first. Sometimes the woods just felt still. I hiked for hours, moving farther from my campsite. The ground was uneven, covered with roots and soft patches of dirt. The smell of wet leaves grew stronger after some light morning frost began to melt. I found tracks here and there, but none fresh enough to follow. The silence continued, heavy and strange. Eventually, I stopped beside a fallen log to rest and drink some water. That was when I noticed something odd. There were fresh boot prints in the soft dirt near the log. They weren't mine. They were larger and deeper, like someone heavier had stepped there recently. The track was clean, meaning it couldn't have been more than a few hours old. It caught me off guard, because I had not seen any vehicles or campers on my way in, not even an old tire mark or leftover fire pit. The place was far from the usual hunting spots. It was the kind of area people only reached if they knew the land well. I stood there for a moment, listening, The forest stayed quiet, almost too quiet. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but nothing moved. I tried to brush it off. Maybe another hunter had come through at dawn. Maybe someone passed by and kept going. It was possible. Still, something about the depth of the prints bothered me. They sank deep into the soil, deeper than mine, and the stride looked wide, like whoever walked there had unusually long legs. I tried to continue hunting, but my focus kept slipping. I checked over my shoulder more often, listening for anything unusual. Hours passed with no sign of any animal, no movement at all, nothing but the crunch of my own boots. Around late afternoon, I turned back toward my camp. The walk back felt different. The trees seemed closer together, and shadows stretched long across the forest floor. The cold settled into my clothes even though it wasn't yet evening. When I reached the clearing, something in my stomach tightened. My tent was still there, but small details looked slightly off. My backpack, which I had left zipped shut, had the zipper a few inches open. My water bottle, which I always kept beside the tent flap, was lying on its side. Nothing was destroyed or taken, but it felt like someone had touched my things, maybe even looked through them. A thick, uneasy feeling spread through me. I checked inside the backpack, making sure nothing was missing. My food, tools, notebooks, everything was still in place. It didn't make sense. There was no wind strong enough to move the bottle or open a zipper. No animal would do something that neat. It looked like human hands had done it. My mind raced for explanations, but none felt good. I decided to keep calm, even though the sun was already lowering behind the trees. I gathered wood for a small fire and made something warm to eat. The heat helped settle me a little, but that uneasy feeling never really went away. I kept scanning the edges of the clearing, half expecting to see someone standing among the trees. The longer I stayed out there, the more I realized the silence wasn't right. Even at dusk, there should have been birds or small sounds of life. Instead, the forest felt drained, as if something had pushed everything else away. I finally crawled into my tent after putting out the fire. I lay inside my sleeping bag, listening to the faint tapping of cold wind against the fabric. My heartbeat felt too loud in my ears. Hours passed slowly. I couldn't fall asleep, and around midnight, I heard the sound. It was the soft snapping of a branch, light but deliberate, too heavy to be a rabbit, too precise to be the wind. The sound came from the trees to the right of my tent. Then another, one slow step, then another. The footsteps were steady, careful, as if someone was trying not to make noise. The forest stayed dark, but I felt every hair on my body stand up. I didn't move. I didn't breathe too hard. I just lay there, staring at the roof of the tent, feeling the cold push deeper into me. The footsteps stopped near the edge of the clearing. For a long time, nothing happened. I couldn't tell if whoever or whatever was out there had left or was still standing completely still. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. At some point, I must have dozed off from exhaustion, because I woke up suddenly to pale morning light, my heart racing like I had been running. I got out of the tent quickly, scanning the clearing. The ground near the trees was disturbed. There were footprints, fresh ones, larger than mine, the same size as the prints I had seen earlier that day. They circled the clearing once and then led back into the woods. They had come close, too close. I felt a cold pressure in my chest as I stared at them. That was enough. I didn't pack slowly or calmly. I grabbed everything with shaking hands and threw it into the back of my truck. The sky was overcast, giving the morning a dull gray color that made the forest look even more lifeless. I kept checking the trees as I worked, feeling watched every second. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling never left. When I finally slammed the truck door shut, I took one last look at the clearing. The tracks were still visible, leading back into the heavy trees, disappearing into the darkness between them. I didn't want to know where they went. I didn't want to wait to see if the person would come back. I turned the key and drove out of there as fast as the uneven dirt path allowed. The farther I got from the forest, the easier it became to breathe. The silence behind me felt heavy, like whatever had been watching me was still standing there, listening to my truck fade away. Even once I reached the main road, a part of me kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following me. But no one did. Back home, I replayed everything in my mind over and over. The strange footprints, the subtle changes in my camp, the silent forest, the slow footsteps in the night. It took days before I could sleep normally again, and even now, years later, the memory still unsettles me. I never went back to that area. I told myself there was no reason to return. There were plenty of other places to hunt. And deep down, I knew the real reason. Something or someone had been out there with me. Something entirely real and entirely human. Something that stepped close to my tent in the darkness and stood just far enough away to stay unseen. I still don't know what they wanted. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Maybe just the sick thrill of watching someone who didn't know they were being watched. I only know one thing for sure. If I hadn't left that morning, I don't think I would have walked out of those woods at all. I still think about that night sometimes, even though years have passed. It was the summer of 2018, and I had just turned 24. I wanted a quiet weekend away from people, away from noise, away from everything. I picked a place far from any city, an old forest area in northern Idaho, a little spot I found on a small hiking forum. Most people didn't go there because the road was rough and there were no official campsites, just old fire pits and a few flat spaces where you could place a tent. That's exactly what I wanted: silence and open space. I left early in the morning and drove for hours until the paved road turned into gravel, then dirt, then something that barely looked like a path. My car bounced over rocks and potholes. Branches scraped the sides, and I kept checking my mirrors because I knew if my car broke down there, I would have to walk miles for help. When I finally reached a clearing, I parked beside a small hill and stepped out. The air smelled like pine and cold soil. The sun was bright but soft, like it was trying to warm the ground but never fully could. I walked around the area to get a feel for it. The trees were tall and close together, their trunks dark and rough, with thin branches bending in odd shapes. There were old burn marks on the ground that looked like someone had made a campfire there maybe months or even years earlier. I found a flat spot just far enough from the trees to feel open, but close enough to not feel completely exposed. I set up my tent slowly, taking my time, making sure the stakes were deep and the rain fly tight. I gathered wood, sorted it into small sticks and thicker logs, and got everything ready before the day cooled off. By the time evening came, everything felt still. The forest around me was calm in that heavy way, where it feels like everything is watching you but nothing is making a sound. I cooked a simple meal on my little stove and sat by the fire until the sky turned purple, then dark blue, then almost black. The stars came out slowly, sharp and cold looking. It was one of those nights where you feel the weight of the sky above you, like you're too small and too alone under it. I eventually crawled into my tent and lay down on my sleeping bag. I left the outer door slightly open to let some cool air inside, since the day had been warm. I tried to sleep, but at first my body just felt too awake. I kept shifting around, adjusting the pillow, adjusting my blanket, listening to the fire crackle outside. After a while, the fire settled into low glowing embers, and the small sounds of the forest came back. Leaves moving, small animals pushing through grass, little cracks in the distance that came and went with the wind. I must have dozed off because I don't remember the moment I fell asleep. But I do remember the moment I woke up. It was sudden. My eyes opened like something had snapped inside my head. I didn't know why at first. The tent was dark, and the air felt colder than before. My breath came out in thin white clouds. I stayed completely still, my ears straining for some sound that would explain why I was awake. Then I heard it. Not footsteps exactly, more like slow movement through the brush. A steady, dragging sound mixed with the soft crunch of leaves. It wasn't a deer. Deer move lightly and fast, and when they stop, they freeze completely. This sound was heavier, more deliberate. It moved with a slow rhythm, pausing for a few seconds, then dragging again, then pausing. I felt the muscles in my arms tighten. I didn't move or sit up. I just listened, trying to understand how far away it was. It wasn't right next to the tent, but it wasn't far either. Maybe 20 or 30 feet, close enough that I could hear branches being pushed aside. I lay there, staring at the fabric of the tent, waiting for the sound to fade. But it didn't fade. It circled. I didn't want to believe that at first. I told myself it was just an animal wandering around. But the sound wasn't random. It moved in a path around me. Left side, behind me, right side, pausing, dragging, pausing again. Like someone walking slowly in a circle around the tent while trying not to step on something loud. My heartbeat felt like it was shaking the entire sleeping bag. I tried to breathe quietly, but every small breath sounded too loud in the silence. The cold air outside made everything sharper, like the darkness itself was listening. I thought about shouting, but there was something about the way the sound moved that made me feel like silence was the only thing keeping me safe. I didn't want whatever it was to know I was awake. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer. Time felt strange. The sound kept circling, sometimes stopping for so long I thought it was gone, then starting again on the opposite side of the tent. At one point, there was a faint scraping sound, like fingers or something thin brushing against bark. That was when it hit me. This wasn't an animal. Animals don't move like that, and they don't circle tents quietly for long stretches of time. Something else was out there. I kept my eyes open, staring at the faint shape of the tent wall. I could feel every beat of my pulse in my throat. Then the sound stopped again, but this time the pause felt different, heavier, like the air itself was waiting. Then I heard a soft exhale. Not mine, not an animal, a human. It was faint but clear. A slow, controlled breath, the kind someone makes when they are trying not to make noise. The breath came from the back of the tent, only a few steps away. My whole body froze. I didn't blink. I didn't swallow. I didn't even breathe for a second. I just lay there, listening, trying to steady my mind, telling myself not to panic. The breath came again, then footsteps, this time actual footsteps. Slow, careful steps moving away from the tent, not quickly, not running, just walking calmly back into the trees. The forest fell silent after that, completely silent. I waited for hours before the sky finally began to lighten. When the first pale light touched the tent fabric, I finally forced myself to move. My hands were stiff, and my legs felt weak when I stepped outside. The ground around my tent told the rest of the story. There were footprints in the dirt, human footprints. Not boots, not hiking shoes, bare feet. The prints circled my tent again and again. A messy loop made by someone who had walked around me for a long time in the dark. On a fallen log nearby, there were marks. Long scratch-like lines that looked like they were made by a tool or a rock. And on the top of the log, pressed into the dust, was a single handprint. Large. Too large to be mine. I didn't pack slowly. I didn't eat. I didn't even look around more than I needed to. I threw everything into the back of my car, kicked dirt over the fire pit, and drove out of that place faster than I should have on roads like that. I didn't stop driving until I reached a town with people, cars, lights, anything that didn't feel like the cold silence of the night before. And the ending was simple. Nothing followed me. Nothing strange happened afterward, and no reports came out about any missing people or dangerous criminals in the area. No mystery was solved. No explanation was ever found. But the ending was also clear in a different way. Someone had found me out there. Someone who didn't speak, didn't run, didn't try to break in or hurt me directly. Someone who simply walked around my tent slowly in the darkness, breathing quietly, watching. Someone who chose a place with no nearby homes, no cell service, no quick escape. Someone who watched me sleep without saying a word. And that, in the most realistic way, was worse than any ghost story I had ever heard. It taught me something I will never forget. When you camp alone in a place far from everyone, the scariest thing you can meet out there isn't the forest or the dark or your imagination. It's another person who knows you're alone. I haven't camped by myself since. I drove into the northern part of Alberta in the summer of 2019, a little more than an hour past the last small town where the gas station looked like it hadn't changed since the 80s. I was 26 then, still thinking I could handle long stretches of silence and forests that felt too large to exist in one lifetime. I had planned the trip for weeks. I wanted a simple weekend alone, nothing complicated, just a tent, a small fire, some food, and the feeling of being far from everything. Life had been loud that year, and silence seemed like the only thing I craved. The gravel road leading into the forest felt endless. Thick lines of trees closed in on both sides, their branches reaching over the road like they were trying to hide it. The deeper I drove, the more the air changed. It smelled colder, even though it was warm outside, and it carried this faint scent of wet soil and old pine needles. When I finally reached the clearing that I had marked on my map earlier that month, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease, though I ignored the unease like I usually did. The clearing was wide enough for my small tent and my car, with a narrow path walking deeper into the woods that I didn't plan on taking. I liked staying close to the vehicle. The grass was tall around the edges, bending under the soft wind, and the ground crunched with dry twigs. I set up my tent slowly, taking my time, stretching out the minutes of the quiet that I had supposedly come for. The sky above was a pale blue with no signs of clouds, and the sun filtered through the tops of the trees in thin golden lines. After everything was set up, I walked around the clearing, just trying to get used to the environment. There was no sound besides wind and birds, the kind that repeated the same short calls over and over. No running water, no signs of other campers, no distant engines. It was peaceful enough that I almost forgot how remote the place actually was. By late afternoon, I started a small fire with the wood I collected from the edges of the clearing. The sun began to dip behind the tree line, and shadows stretched longer and darker. I sat near the fire, eating, warming my hands, watching little sparks shoot upward every time a piece of wood snapped. Everything felt calm, maybe too calm. I kept glancing behind me even though there was nothing there but trees. As night came in, the air cooled fast. The fire was the only thing keeping me warm, and the light from it made the tall grass around the clearing look like it was moving even when the wind had died down. I could hear insects buzzing and the occasional crack from somewhere in the woods. Every time a branch snapped in the distance, my body tightened. I kept reminding myself that animals lived out here. Deer, maybe even elk. Nothing dangerous if I stayed in my spot. When it grew completely dark, the forest turned into one solid wall of black around me. The fire only lit a small circle, and beyond that circle, everything disappeared. Even the sky looked darker than before. I sat with my arms wrapped around my knees, listening, breathing slowly, trying not to imagine things moving in the shadows. I stayed out there longer than I wanted to because going into the tent felt worse. The tent felt like a thin plastic bag separating me from whatever might be walking around out there. But eventually I crawled inside. I zipped it shut, turned on my small lantern, and lay down on my sleeping bag. The lantern cast this dim glow on the inside walls, and the fabric moved slightly whenever wind brushed against it. I could still hear the fire crackling outside, though it was burning lower and lower. I must have drifted off for a few minutes, but something woke me. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear. It was just a shift in the natural noise outside, like the way silence feels different when something new has entered it. I opened my eyes and stared at the top of the tent, not moving, just listening. My heart started beating fast, and my body felt strangely warm even though the air was cold. Then I heard it again, this soft, slow crunch of dry grass. Not quick steps, not an animal rushing. Something moving with weight, with intention, stepping carefully. I stayed completely still. My breathing got quieter on its own. The steps came closer, stopping every few seconds like whoever or whatever was out there kept pausing to look around. I pictured a bear at first, but the steps didn't match. They sounded too controlled. Bears move with heavy, uneven thuds. This was slow, quiet, spaced out like someone testing the ground before each step. I could see the faint outline of the tent wall shift slightly, like something outside had passed by the fire and blocked the light for a second. My skin went cold. I waited, counting the seconds between steps. They circled halfway around my tent, then stopped completely. The silence after that was worse than the footsteps. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I kept listening for breathing, for another crack, for anything, but nothing came. It stayed silent for so long that I started wondering if I had imagined everything. Maybe I had been half asleep, but when I looked at the tent wall again, I noticed the faintest shadow. It wasn't clear, but it was tall, taller than me, and it stayed there without moving. My body locked up. My hands felt numb. I didn't know what to do. If I made noise, I'd reveal that I was awake. If I stayed silent, maybe it would eventually leave. I listened to my heartbeat pounding in my ears and tried to stay calm. Minutes passed. Real minutes, long and dragging, before the shadow finally shifted a little, like someone leaning slightly to one side. Then the steps started again, slow, retreating this time. The moment I realized the sound was moving away, my whole body felt weak. I stayed lying down until I was sure the steps were completely gone, then reached slowly for the zipper of the tent. I didn't open it. I just held it, ready, in case I needed to get out fast. But I couldn't force myself to unzip it. The idea of being outside in that darkness with something that had been right next to me felt worse than staying in the thin shelter I had. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first pale light came through the trees, I finally stepped outside. The fire had burned down to almost nothing. The clearing was colder than it had been the night before, the air sharp and still. I looked around slowly, scanning every patch of grass, every tree, every mark on the ground. I found footprints within minutes. They were human, not boot prints, not hiking shoes, bare feet, long, narrow, dirt-covered bare feet. The size looked like a grown adult's. The footprints came from the line of trees, moved around my tent in a wide circle, then went back the same way. I stood there staring at them, feeling sick, realizing that whoever had been out here wasn't lost. They weren't running or rushing. They walked right up to my tent in the middle of the night with no shoes, no light, and no sound except those soft, steady steps. I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands shook while I rolled up the tent, and I kept glancing at the trees. Every minute felt like someone was watching me from between them. I didn't stop to eat or look around again. I just shoved everything into the car and drove out of there without checking my mirror. The entire drive back down that gravel road felt too long. Every bump, every shadow made me jump. I didn't relax until the forest opened and the road widened into the familiar stretch leading toward the highway. What scared me most wasn't the footsteps or the shadow or even the footprints. It was the way those prints moved around my tent. Slow, controlled, patient, like the person already knew I was there and just wanted to stand close enough to hear me inside. I never went back to that area. I never camped alone again after that. The ending was simple and clear in my mind even before I reached home. No matter how much I had wanted silence, that place had given it to me in the wrong way. Not the calm kind. The kind that made it obvious that someone else had been standing in the dark, quietly choosing not to leave until they wanted to. And the worst part, the part that stayed with me long after the trip, was knowing that nothing supernatural had happened. There were no creatures, no strange beings, no impossible shapes. It was just a real person out there, barefoot in the woods, walking toward a lone tent at night. And real people can be far scarier than anything else. I was 31 when I decided to take a short solo camping trip in the Lake District in northern England. It was late autumn of 2019, the kind of season where the trees looked like they were slowly burning down into gold and rust. I had been trying to clear my head after a stressful stretch of work, and 3 quiet days in the hills felt like the only thing that made sense. I packed light, just a small tent, a simple stove, basic food, and a cheap rain jacket I thought would be enough. Looking back, I should have taken the weather warnings more seriously. I reached the trailhead in the early afternoon. The clouds were already thick and low, but the air felt calm, heavy in a way that made sound feel slow. My plan was simple. Hike about 5 miles past the lower woods, follow a narrow stream up a gentle slope, and camp near a small clearing I had seen in a guidebook. It wasn't an official campsite, but many people used it because of the soft ground and the fact that the trees blocked most of the wind. Everything looked normal as I walked. The mud sucked at my boots, and the wet grass brushed cold against my legs. I could hear sheep across the hills, bells clinking faintly through the mist. I reached the clearing just before sunset. It wasn't anything special, just a patch of level ground surrounded by tall, twisted trees, but the place felt quiet in a comforting way. The stream nearby was only a few inches deep, running over smooth stones, and the sound of it made the silence feel less sharp. The sky had gone a dull, flat gray. I set up my tent, hammered the stakes into the soft soil, and boiled water for a quick meal. I remember the smell of damp earth mixing with the steam from the pot, and how the cold air felt sharp in my nose. The rain began lightly around 7. At first, it was just a soft tapping on the tent, almost relaxing. I lay inside my sleeping bag, reading from my phone until the battery slipped down to 15%. I set it aside, wanting to save some power for the next morning, and listened to the rain grow heavier. The drops hit harder, faster, turning from tapping to steady drumming. Within an hour, it was pouring, the kind of rain that feels like it has weight behind it. I should have been asleep, but the sound kept me awake. The wind began to move in sudden short bursts, bending branches above me. Every so often, a drop of water would land on my face from the condensation forming along the top of the tent. I kept checking the seams to make sure they weren't leaking. The ground felt soft under my mat, like the rain was loosening everything beneath me. Sometime after midnight, I felt the first real moment of unease. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a sense that something wasn't quite right. I heard a rustling sound to my right, far too close to the tent. At first I thought it was just the wind pushing branches, but the movement was slow and steady, not the quick flapping kind of noise branches usually make. I held my breath and listened. The rain was heavy, but beneath it I could hear something brushing through the wet undergrowth. Not fast, but deliberate, like someone walking with careful steps. The sound stopped, and the silence felt thicker than before. I waited for a long time, feeling my heartbeat push against my ribs. I told myself it was probably a deer. They were common in the area, and tried to force myself to relax. But something about the pattern of the steps had felt wrong. They had been too spread out, too heavy for a deer, but not heavy enough for a cow. I kept thinking about the guidebook mentioning that farmers sometimes moved livestock across the trails, but even that didn't fit. I decided I wasn't going to look outside. The rain was coming down so hard that I could hear it splashing against the soil, and unzipping the tent would have soaked everything instantly. I tried to focus on my breathing and eventually drifted into a light, uneasy half-sleep. I woke again to an even stranger noise. It sounded like something scraping against fabric, faint but too close to ignore. The noise came from the far side of the tent, slow and dragging, like fingers moving across the surface. My first thought was that it was a branch bending under the weight of the rain and brushing the tent. I reached out and pressed my palm against the wall of the fabric. I expected to feel the curve of a branch pushing in from the outside. Instead, I felt nothing. No pressure, no shape, just the cold dampness of the rain-soaked nylon. The scraping sound came again, lower this time, closer to the ground. My throat tightened. The hair on my arms lifted on its own. It wasn't loud enough to be threatening, but it was so controlled, so measured, that it made every part of me go rigid. I stayed still for what felt like hours. The rain drowned almost everything out, but I kept catching small sounds, soft steps shifting on wet leaves, the faint crack of a stick, the brushing of something moving around the tent. Not fast, not panicked, just steady, purposeful. At some point, I realized that the footsteps weren't circling anymore. They were staying in one spot, a few feet away from the tent's entrance. I could hear the water splashing slightly under the weight of something standing there. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. I didn't understand why anyone would be out here at this hour, in this weather, with no light and no reason. And if it wasn't a person, then it was something large enough to stand upright and still. I stared at the zip of the tent entrance. It hung a few inches from my face. A tiny flap of fabric moved with each gust of wind. I pictured someone standing just outside, watching, trying to decide what they wanted. I felt a sudden urgency to leave, but the idea of unzipping the door and stepping out into the dark with someone, or something, waiting there made my stomach twist. The rain kept falling. Eventually the footsteps moved again, slower this time, like whatever was there had lost interest or grown tired. I listened as the steps faded into the trees, swallowed by the storm. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed sitting upright in my sleeping bag, shaking from the cold and the fear, waiting for the first sign of daylight. When I finally saw the faint gray of dawn through the thin tent fabric, the rain had stopped, but the trees still dripped heavily. I waited another 10 minutes before forcing myself to open the tent. The cold air hit my face instantly, sharp and metallic. I scanned the clearing. The ground around the entrance was disturbed. Mud pushed down in long, irregular shapes. Not boots, not hooves. Something flatter, wider, like the shape of a foot but stretched out. The impressions were ruined by the rain, but they were large enough to make my stomach drop. I didn't waste time. I packed everything as fast as I could, barely bothering to fold the tent properly. My hands were shaking so much I kept dropping things. I didn't even eat. I just wanted to be on the trail and moving away from that clearing as quickly as possible. The walk back to the car felt twice as long as the walk in. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me through the trees. Every gust of wind made me flinch. Every crack of a branch made my legs move faster. By the time I reached the parking area, my clothes were damp, my boots were filled with cold water, and my nerves felt completely burned out. When I finally sat inside the car and shut the door, the silence was almost startling. I sat there for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel, letting the feeling of safety sink in. Nothing had chased me, nothing had followed, but something had stood outside my tent for hours during the heaviest rainstorm I'd ever camped in. Something that moved with patience, not fear. I never went back to that spot. I never reported anything because I didn't even know what I'd be reporting. All I know is that I've camped many times before and after that night, in different countries and different conditions, and nothing has ever made me feel the way that clearing did. I still hear that slow, scraping sound when I think about it. I still picture those long, washed-out prints in the mud. The ending is simple. I left the hills that morning and drove home, and I haven't camped alone in the rain since. Whatever I heard that night wasn't supernatural, and I don't pretend to know what it was. But I know it was real, and I know it was watching me. And that is enough to keep me from ever sleeping in a tent alone on a rainy night again. I decided to go camping alone in the summer of 2019, something I had been wanting to do for a long time. I was 26 then, and I felt like I needed a break from everything. I chose a quiet area in the Peak District, somewhere a little away from common trails but still close enough to a dirt path that I wouldn't get completely lost. The plan was simple: spend 2 nights there, walk around during the day, read a bit, relax, and sleep early. I thought it would be peaceful. I didn't expect anything strange at all. I didn't even think anything strange could happen in a place like that. I arrived around late afternoon. The sky was gray, and the wind was cold even though it was summer. I walked for a bit until I found a flat area near a group of old trees. The ground there was soft and dry enough to set up my tent. There was a long stretch of grass behind me and a narrow path that had probably been used by hikers, but I didn't see anyone. The place felt completely empty. That emptiness was nice at first. It made me feel like I had the whole landscape to myself. I set up my tent slowly, taking my time to make sure everything was tight and stable. I always worried about tents collapsing in the middle of the night, so I double-checked the stakes, tightened the ropes, and tested the zippers. After that, I unpacked my gear, put my food in a small cooler, and walked around for a bit. The air smelled fresh, and the grass brushed against my legs. The silence felt heavy, like there was nothing but wind and my own footsteps. I liked that kind of silence. It made me feel calm. As the sun started to set, the temperature dropped fast. I made a small campfire with dry sticks and sat next to it, warming my hands. I watched the orange light shine against the dark trees and listened to the crackling fire. Felt peaceful and safe. Nothing about the moment felt wrong. I ate a simple dinner, packed everything away carefully, and put my leftover food into a container inside my tent so animals wouldn't mess with it. After that, I crawled inside my sleeping bag and rested on my back, listening to the wind brushing through the trees. I must have fallen asleep for a short while because I remember waking up to a strange sound. It wasn't loud, just sharp enough to catch my attention. It sounded like something stepped on a dry stick. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a fox. Those things were common in the area, so I didn't panic. But when I stayed still and listened more carefully, I realized the steps were too slow and too spaced out. They weren't the quick, light movements of an animal. They were heavy and steady, like someone walking slowly and carefully through the grass. I stayed inside my sleeping bag, staring at the roof of the tent, trying to breathe quietly. I didn't move. I didn't even lift my head. I just listened. The steps came closer but then stopped. The sudden quiet made my chest tighten. I could hear the wind again, but nothing else. I didn't know if whoever or whatever was out there was still standing nearby or had left. I eventually convinced myself I was overthinking and tried to go back to sleep. After a long time, I drifted off again. The next morning, the sun was weak, covered by pale clouds that looked like stretched out smoke. I stepped outside the tent and stretched, feeling stiff. When I looked around, I noticed something strange. About 20 feet from my tent, the grass was pressed down in a shape that looked like someone had been standing there for some time. It wasn't the shape of an animal lying down. It looked more like 2 feet had been planted firmly in that spot. The grass wasn't flattened in a messy way. It looked like someone had stood still there, facing my tent. I stared at it for a long time, trying to tell myself it was nothing. But the more I looked, the more sure I became that someone had been standing there in the dark, watching. Maybe it was a hiker passing through. Maybe it was a local farmer checking the land. I tried to make myself believe all those normal explanations. I forced myself to think that anyone walking nearby late at night would have harmless reasons. Still, I felt uneasy. I walked a bit around the camp area, trying to clear my head. I followed the dirt path for a while and came across an old wooden gate that led into a field. The entire place felt empty, quiet, and wide, with no people anywhere. That emptiness felt different now. It didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like something could hide easily in all that space. When I returned to the camp, I noticed another strange detail. My backpack, which I had left zipped and placed against the inside of the tent, had been moved slightly. Not far, just rotated a bit, like someone had touched it or nudged it while I slept. I knew I didn't move it. I remembered exactly how I had placed it the night before. I spent the whole day feeling tense. Every little sound made me turn my head. Every rustling in the grass made me stop walking. I tried to eat lunch, but my stomach felt tight. I tried to read a book, but I couldn't focus. I kept looking around the trees, expecting to see someone standing behind them. When evening came, I debated packing up and leaving early, but I didn't want to walk through fading light. I told myself it would be okay, that I would stay alert and keep my lantern on inside the tent. The second night, I didn't make a fire. I didn't want any attention on me. The air felt colder, and the silence felt heavier. I got inside the tent earlier than usual, zipped everything tightly, and sat inside my sleeping bag, listening. The wind was stronger that night. The tent walls shook lightly with each gust. Hours passed like that. I didn't sleep. I didn't even try to. I just waited. Around maybe 2 in the morning, I heard it again. Slow steps in the grass. Heavy, careful. This time there was no doubt. It was a person. My whole body froze. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I just stayed still and stared at the wall of the tent, watching the fabric move slightly with the wind. The steps came closer and closer until they stopped right outside. I could hear breathing, slow, steady breathing. Not loud, but close enough that I knew the person was standing only inches away from me. I could picture them standing there, listening for movement inside. My heart was beating so hard that I was scared it would give me away. I didn't move for a long time. Whoever was out there didn't move either. They just stood there, like they were waiting. The breathing would stop for a few seconds, then start again. I felt like I was going to faint. My fingers were shaking inside the sleeping bag. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard the steps again, this time moving away. Slow at first, then fading into the distance. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I waited until the sky turned blue and the sun rose. The moment I saw light outside the tent, I grabbed everything I could, shoved it into my bags without folding anything, and left. I didn't even look back. I just walked fast down the path, trying to stay on solid ground until I got back to my car. When I finally reached my car, I sat inside for a long time, trying to breathe normally. I looked around the empty parking area, making sure no one was watching me. Only then did I start the engine. I didn't stop until I reached a town far from the campsite. I never found out who that man was, why he was there, or how long he had been watching me. I never went camping alone again, and I probably never will. Every time I think about it, I remember that pressed spot in the grass, those slow steps, and that silent breathing just outside the thin wall of my tent. The ending was simple but clear. I left early, I stayed safe, and I learned that being alone in a quiet place doesn't always mean you're truly alone. I still think about it sometimes, about how close that person was and how easily things could have gone wrong. But I'm alive, unharmed, and far away from that place now, and that's enough for me. I was 29 in the summer of 2019 when I decided to take a short camping trip alone in northern Colorado, near a place called Dry Ridge. It wasn't a famous spot, and that was exactly why I picked it. I didn't want crowds or noise. I wanted a quiet break away from everything, just a weekend to reset my head. Life had been too loud, too busy, and I felt like I hadn't taken a deep breath in months. I drove out late in the afternoon, with the sun still high enough to feel warm on my arms as I kept one hand out the open window. The air smelled dry, almost dusty, and the grass on both sides of the gravel road looked pale from the heat. I remember thinking it was the kind of place where time moved slower, where days felt longer. There were no buildings nearby except a closed ranger shed that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I parked my car beside a patch of short trees that didn't offer much shade, just enough to help me unload my gear without sweating too hard. The ground felt uneven under my boots, soft in some spots but firm in others. I walked around a bit, checking the area before picking a flat section near a narrow stream. The stream wasn't strong. The water moved lazily, barely making a sound. It was perfect for what I wanted: quiet, empty, still. I set up my tent slowly, taking my time to tie everything tight and hammer the stakes deep so the wind wouldn't lift the whole thing overnight. The sun started dipping lower behind the hills, turning the sky a dull orange color. The temperature dropped a little, making the air feel cooler against my skin. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove, just canned food and some bread, nothing special. I wasn't there for fancy camping. I just wanted calm. After eating, I walked a little farther down the stream. The surface of the water caught the fading light, turning it into long strips of gold. For some reason, the place felt both peaceful and strangely empty, like something was missing. I brushed the thought off as nothing more than my mind overthinking in the quiet. When it got dark, I climbed into my tent, zipped the door halfway, and lay on top of my sleeping bag. I couldn't fall asleep right away. The silence felt too complete. Every so often I heard a small rustle from the grass outside or the soft push of water in the stream. Those tiny noises felt louder than they should. I kept telling myself it was just nature, just normal sounds. Sometime around midnight, I finally drifted off. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up again. It couldn't have been too long. The air still felt warm, not cold like early morning. What woke me up wasn't a specific sound, but a strange sense that something had changed outside. It was the kind of feeling you get when you walk into a room and immediately know something isn't right even if you can't see it. I sat still for a moment, listening to the quiet. My tent was dark, and the fabric moved a little from a breeze that I couldn't feel inside. My heartbeat felt heavy in my ears, and every small noise outside seemed sharper. I lay back down but couldn't relax. Something felt off, something that made my skin crawl without any clear reason. After a few minutes of trying to ignore it, I decided to step out and get some cool air. Sometimes that helps when you can't sleep. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The ground felt colder under my feet, and the air smelled different. Less fresh, more damp, almost like wet soil that had been turned over recently. The moon was bright enough to light up the area. I could see my car, the stream, the uneven ground, the trees. Everything looked normal, but the feeling didn't go away. I didn't know what I expected to find, but something inside me kept pushing me to look around. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the stream. The water reflected the moonlight, and the surface looked smooth except for a few ripples. As I got closer, a smell hit me. It was faint at first, just a strange bitter scent that I couldn't place. I thought maybe it was a dead animal somewhere in the grass. That wouldn't be unusual. This area was full of wildlife. But the smell grew stronger the more I walked. It wasn't the smell of a dead animal I was familiar with. It was heavier, thicker, almost sweet in a sickening way. My stomach tightened. I stopped walking for a moment, letting the flashlight beam sweep across the grass on the opposite side of the stream. That's when I saw it. A shape lying partly in the grass and partly in the mud near the bank. At first I thought it was just a camping bag someone left behind, maybe an old backpack washed there by the stream. But the shape didn't look right for that. It was too still, too solid. The flashlight beam shook in my hand as I slowly moved closer, not because I wanted to but because my body walked forward before my mind could stop it. When I got close enough for the light to fully hit it, my legs froze. It was a body, a real human body. It lay on its side, facing away from me. The clothes were dirty and torn in places, smeared with mud, dried blood, and dark patches that looked older. The person didn't move at all. The skin that was visible looked pale, almost gray under the moonlight. The position of the limbs looked unnatural, twisted slightly like the person had fallen hard and hadn't been moved since. My throat felt tight, and my hands went cold. I backed up slowly, my boots pressing deep into the soft ground. The air around the body smelled stronger now, the thick decay pushing into my nose, making me feel lightheaded. I didn't want to look closer. I didn't want to see the face. I already knew the person was dead. The stillness in the air made it very clear. I turned around and started walking fast back toward my tent. Every part of me wanted to run, but I forced myself not to. Running felt like it might attract something, even though I didn't know what. My chest felt tight, my breathing thin. My mind kept replaying the shape of the body, the way it lay half in the mud, the pale skin, the smell. I couldn't think straight. When I reached my tent, I didn't go inside. I crouched next to it, trying to steady my breathing. I needed to leave. I knew that instantly. Nothing good could come from staying near a dead person in the middle of nowhere, with no one else around. It wasn't just fear. It was instinct. Something about the scene felt wrong in a deeper way, like whoever the person was had not simply fallen or gotten lost. I grabbed my keys and shoved everything I could into the back seat without caring how it landed. My heart hammered as I kept checking the trees around me, half expecting someone to appear. The air felt thicker, heavier, and I could still smell the faint rot even from far away. My hands shook as I tossed the last bags inside and slammed the door. The drive back to the road felt endless. The gravel popped loudly under my tires, and every bump made me flinch. I kept looking at the rearview mirror even though I didn't know what I expected to see. The sky remained dark, but it felt like something was pressing against my back the entire time, like the darkness itself was watching me leave. When I reached the highway, I didn't slow down. I drove straight into the next town, parked in a gas station lot, and stayed there with the engine running for a long time. My hands were still shaking. My clothes smelled like dirt and cold air. I sat there until I felt steady enough to call the sheriff's office and report what I found. They asked where it was, and I told them. They said they would send people out, and I believed them. I didn't go back. I didn't want to see it again. Later, I heard that the body belonged to a missing hiker who had been searched for a few weeks earlier. They didn't release all the details, but they said it looked like he had died from a fall, probably slipping near the bank during the night. They said he had been out there longer than they expected, and heavy rain might have moved him closer to the stream. I accepted the explanation because it made sense. Nature can be brutal and accidents happen, but something in the way the body lay, the strange twisted position, the smell, and the quiet heaviness of the place made me feel like the story was only half true. I haven't camped alone since that night. I still enjoy nature, but not in the same way. The silence no longer feels peaceful. Feels like something waiting. When I think back to that night, I can still see the pale skin under the moonlight and smell the damp, rotting air. And every time I remember it, I feel that same cold pressure on my back, like the darkness behind me is reminding me of what I saw and how close I was to stepping on it without knowing. I picked a random stretch of forest in northern Wyoming for my weekend trip, a place I had never camped before. It was late September of 2019, and the weather was already colder than I expected. I was 27 back then, stubborn and convinced I needed a few days away from people and noise. I drove out alone with my pack, my old tent, a basic knife, a camp stove, and a cooler that barely fit in the back of my car. I reached the trailhead around noon and started the hike in, moving deeper into the woods than I normally would. The air felt clean but sharp, and the sky had that thin, pale look it gets before the days start shortening faster. I didn't choose any official campsite. I walked until my legs were tired and then went off trail slightly to set up on a flat patch between a cluster of tall spruce trees. The ground was dry enough, though covered in needles and cold earth. As I pitched my tent, I could hear nothing except the wind brushing through the branches and the soft clicks of insects somewhere in the undergrowth. It felt empty in a comforting way. I cooked a simple meal, ate in silence, and watched the sun fade behind the tree line. The cold settled quickly after that, biting into my fingers even with gloves on. I crawled into my tent early, bundled in my sleeping bag, and listened to the forest breathe around me. Nothing strange happened that first night, aside from a few animals moving around in the distance. Deer maybe, something lighter than a bear. Normal stuff. The next morning I woke up at dawn, shivering even though I'd slept in layers. The air smelled like wet soil even though it hadn't rained. I stepped out of my tent and looked around, stretching my stiff back. That was when I noticed something odd. The pine needles around my campsite were disturbed in a way that didn't match my movements from the day before. There were long, shallow marks in the ground, almost like someone had dragged something heavy but narrow across the earth. They weren't claw marks or tracks I recognized. They were lines, just thin lines, leading from the trees toward the backside of my tent, then looping away. At first I thought maybe a branch had fallen and rolled, or maybe some animal had pulled something across the ground. But I didn't see any broken branches or signs of an animal dragging prey. I brushed it off. Maybe I had stepped wrong or kicked something without remembering. I tried not to overthink it. I spent the day hiking along a ridge that offered a distant view of the snowy peaks to the west. The wind-up there was sharp enough to sting my face, but the scenery was worth it. I didn't see anyone the entire time, not even far off on the trails. By late afternoon, my legs were sore and my throat felt dry from breathing the cold air, so I headed back. When I reached my campsite, something felt off immediately. I couldn't name it, but it was a heavy feeling in my gut. My tent looked the same, untouched. My food bags were still tied up in the tree where I had hung them, but the air felt still in a strange way, as if the forest around me was holding its breath. I tried to ignore that feeling too. I cooked dinner, ate it slowly, and sat on a fallen log listening to the fading light. As evening settled, the forest sounds changed, and not in the normal way. Usually animals get quieter as the night deepens, but this was different. Everything went dead silent too early, almost unnaturally early. Even the wind stalled. I could hear my own heartbeat louder than anything else. That uneasy feeling returned, stronger this time, like someone watching me from between the trees. I kept glancing around. I saw nothing. No shapes. No shadows moving. Nothing that explained the crawling sensation under my skin. I forced myself to get into the tent once it got too cold to sit outside. Inside, I zipped myself in, clicked on my small lantern, and tried to read a book to take my mind off my nerves. It worked for a while. Then I felt it. Just after midnight, the ground near my tent seemed to shift slightly, not like footsteps, more like something brushing over the needles again. A light scraping sound. It was faint but close, very close. I held my breath. The scraping moved slowly along the side of the tent, then paused. I didn't dare move. I didn't have any weapon except my knife, which suddenly felt useless. The sound moved again, this time toward the back of the tent. exactly where those strange lines had been earlier in the morning. I stayed completely still, focusing on breathing as quietly as possible. I could hear my sleeping bag rustle slightly with my heartbeat. The scraping sound lasted maybe 10 seconds, then faded. I stayed frozen for at least an hour after that, listening, waiting, barely blinking. The forest stayed silent. At some point I fell asleep, but it wasn't real sleep, just drifting in and out, my body refusing to fully relax. When I stepped out at dawn, the cold hit me first. The second thing that hit me was fear. There were more lines scratched into the ground now, circling part of my tent. Some were fresh, cutting through the thin frost that had formed overnight. They weren't deep, and they weren't footprints. It looked like someone had dragged a stick or metal rod or something similar around the tent. But if it was a person, why would they circle the tent like that? Why not approach directly? Why not say anything or leave signs of actual footsteps? I looked carefully for boot prints. Nothing, not even faint impressions. I told myself it could have been an animal after all, maybe something dragging a branch. But branches don't make perfect, smooth, narrow lines that loop and curve like controlled movements. I felt a burning urge to leave, and that sudden clarity scared me even more than the lines. I'm not the type to cut a trip short over weird noises, but something was deeply wrong here. I packed my gear fast, barely eating or drinking anything. My hands shook the entire time, not from cold but from that instinct that tells you something is wrong long before your mind catches up. As I stuffed the tent into its bag, I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting to see someone or something. The forest remained empty, too empty. The hike back felt twice as long as the hike in. Every cracking twig behind me made me turn around. Every gust of wind made my heart jump. I walked fast, almost running at times, my breath turning to steam in front of me. The deeper I went toward the trailhead, the more convinced I became that someone had been near my tent that night. Not an animal, someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who moved quietly enough to circle my tent in the dark. Someone who made no footsteps but dragged something lightly across the ground. By the time I reached my car, the fear had settled into a dull, steady ache in my stomach. I threw my pack inside, got in, and locked the doors immediately. Only then did I notice what finally made everything click. On the passenger side window, faint but visible in the thin morning light, was a narrow streak of dirt. A long, smooth line drawn across the glass. Just one. A single line. I hadn't parked near any bushes or trees. Nothing could have brushed the window naturally. I wiped it away with my sleeve, started the engine, and didn't look back as I drove away. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out onto the empty road behind me. I never figured out what caused those markings, and I didn't report it because I didn't have anything useful to tell. No face, no description, no proof beyond a pattern in dirt and a feeling in my gut. But I haven't camped alone since that weekend. The forest is still beautiful to me, still something I love, but I'm not stupid enough to pretend that being deep in the woods means being completely alone. Whatever was out there with me that night had been close enough to circle my tent without a sound, close enough to touch my car before I even arrived. And I'm certain of one thing now. Sometimes the scariest encounters aren't the ones you see, but the ones that move around you quietly, letting you know in small ways that you were never actually alone. I planned that trip in late September of 2019, when the weather in northern Arizona had started to cool down, but the nights were still warm enough to sleep outside without feeling miserable. I had been working long hours at a small auto shop in Reno and wanted a full break from everything. No phone, no people, no traffic, nothing. I picked a quiet patch of land near the Kaibab National Forest, not too far from the Utah border. I had been there once years before with family, but this time I wanted to be alone to clear my head. I was 29 then, old enough to know better and still young enough to ignore that feeling. I drove out early in the morning, taking my time along the empty roads. The land out there stretches the way your mind stretches when you stare too long at nothing. Wide, burnt orange soil, scattered brush, long lines of pine trees in the distance, and a sky that feels too big for a single person. My old silver truck rattled every mile, and I kept glancing at the fuel gauge even though I had filled the tank before leaving. When you're far from towns, even normal noises feel like warnings. By late afternoon, I found a flat clearing far from the dirt road. The ground was dry and cracked, with small rocks that clicked under my boots as I walked. I picked a spot near a thin line of trees, their trunks dark and twisted from years of wind. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and took a slow walk around the area to see what was nearby. The air smelled like pine sap and dust. Small animal tracks crossed the dirt, but nothing fresh. Felt like no one had been out there for days. When the sun started to sink, the temperature dropped fast. I lit a fire and warmed a can of chili, listening to the wind slide through the branches. The sky turned a deep blue, then black, and the stars came out so sharp and clear they almost looked fake. It was the kind of night that makes you feel both lucky and uneasy, like something could be watching from the dark and you wouldn't know until it moved. I stayed outside for a while, letting the fire die slowly. When I finally crawled into my tent, I felt calm. I thought the night would be quiet. It wasn't. I woke up sometime around 2 in the morning. I couldn't tell why at first. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a noise I fully understood. It was more of a shift in the air, like something in the environment had changed enough to pull me out of sleep. I lay still, listening to my heartbeat. The wind had stopped completely. The forest felt frozen. Then I heard soft crunching on the ground. Not fast, not heavy, but slow and spaced apart. The steps didn't match any animal I had heard before. They weren't the quick taps of a small creature or the heavy thuds of something large. These were careful steps, like someone testing where to place their feet. I stayed as still as I could, breathing through my nose, my ears straining. The steps moved along the edge of my campsite, circling wider than the glow of the fire pit. I remembered then that the moon was thin that night, offering almost no light. The footsteps paused, and I could feel the silence press against the tent walls. I imagined someone standing a few yards away, staring straight at the shape of my tent. I felt a slow, cold wave crawl through my chest. My sleeping bag felt like a trap, pinning me down. My mind kept repeating that I was miles from anyone, far off the road, too far for someone to just stumble out there by mistake. The footsteps started again, even slower this time, and drifted off toward the tree line. I listened until I couldn't hear anything at all. I didn't move for almost an hour. When I finally fell asleep again, it was only because my body couldn't stay awake any longer. When the sun came up, I crawled out of the tent and scanned the campsite. I hoped maybe it had been an animal, maybe my tired mind had made it sound human. But the prints on the ground weren't shaped like paws. They weren't shaped like boots either. They were too narrow and too long, pressed lightly into the dirt, as if the person had been walking on the front part of their feet. I followed the trail for a while into the trees until it vanished into a patch of hard ground. I tried to stay calm. People hike out there all the time. Maybe someone was camping nearby and wandered through without thinking. But the way the steps circled my tent didn't feel like someone passing by. Felt like someone watching. I decided to stay one more night, though a part of me already knew I should pack up and leave. Something about giving up and rushing home made me feel pathetic. I convinced myself I had imagined the worst of it. I spent the whole day exploring a ridge a few miles from camp. The view stretched out for miles in every direction, dry land and dark pines and a long narrow canyon to the east. I stayed out there until the sun started to lower again. When I returned, everything at camp looked untouched. But as I set my pack down, something caught my eye. A small rock, one that I hadn't seen there before, sat perfectly centered on top of my folded jacket near the tent. I knew I hadn't put it there. The shape was too smooth, too round, like someone had picked it carefully. The hairs on my arms rose. I scanned the trees. Everything looked the same, but the quiet felt heavy again. I stuffed the rock deep into my pack, even though I didn't know why. Maybe some part of me didn't want to leave it behind like a message. The sky turned dark faster than the night before, and I didn't bother making a fire. I didn't want to give off light. I sat in my tent with my flashlight off, listening. Every sound outside felt sharper. The crunch of a pine needle, the faint shift of wind, my own breathing. Around midnight, I heard the steps again. This time they came from the opposite side. Slow, uneven, careful. My skin prickled as they circled the tent again, almost the same path as the night before. I clenched my fists, trying to keep quiet even though my breathing felt too loud. The steps stopped right at the back of the tent. I could feel the exact spot like a cold point pressing through the thin fabric. I couldn't move. My muscles locked in place. I waited for the zipper to move, for a hand to grab the tent wall, for something to happen. Anything. But nothing did. The steps retreated again, slower than before, until they faded into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I waited for the sun like it was the only thing keeping me alive. When morning came, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. I froze. A second rock sat by the fire pit, this one flatter and darker than the one from before. Next to it was a small line drawn in the dirt, 3 short scratches, spaced evenly apart. I had no idea what they meant, but my stomach twisted the moment I saw them. I packed everything within minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't look around. I didn't even check for more tracks. I grabbed my gear, stuffed it into the truck, and drove out of that place so fast the tires spat dust for a long trail behind me. Only when I reached the highway did I start to breathe normally again. For weeks after returning home, I kept checking my backyard at night, watching the shadows between my house and the fence. I kept imagining those slow, careful steps somewhere outside, waiting for me to fall asleep. I never figured out who or what had been out there. No missing hiker reports, no stories from locals, nothing. But I still have those 2 rocks. I didn't mean to keep them, but when I unpacked my bags, they were still buried at the bottom. I couldn't bring myself to throw them out, and I don't know why. They sit in a small drawer under my bed, far from sight but never far from mind. And the part that stays with me the most isn't the noise or the steps or even the rocks. It's the feeling that whoever was out there didn't rush, didn't panic, didn't act wild or confused. They moved slowly, calmly, like they had all the time in the world. Like watching someone sleep was normal to them. That's the part one can't shake, because people only move that quietly when they've done it before. I drove out to northern Arizona in late October of 2019, wanting a break from work and noise. I was 27 then, tired of screens and alarms and the steady pressure of the city. I picked an area a little west of Tuba City, somewhere far from the highway but close enough to dirt roads I could manage with my old SUV. I wasn't trying to explore anything dangerous or strange. I just wanted peace, a night alone, and the kind of quiet you only get in wide, empty land. The weather was dry but cold enough that the air stung my nose when I stepped out to set up the tent. The landscape around me looked endless, flat stretches of scrub, low broken hills, and distant mesas with sharp edges glowing orange as the sun dropped. I didn't see any cars, any hikers, any signs that people had been around recently. The ground was dusty, packed hard by years of wind. Even my footprints looked strange, barely sinking in. I set up the tent slowly, trying to calm my breathing after the long drive. My hands were stiff from gripping the steering wheel. Once the tent was done, I gathered a small ring of rocks for a fire, even though I planned to keep it tiny. I wasn't trying to make light or noise. I wanted the opposite. I wanted that feeling of being tucked away where no one cared what I was doing. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. The wind went from a soft push to long, steady gusts that shook dry branches. I sat by the small fire, eating a simple meal from a metal container, listening to the crackle of wood and the constant rustle of desert plants bending under the wind. Nothing felt strange yet. Nothing felt wrong. It was just empty land, cold air, and the comfort of knowing I had no one to answer to for the night. Eventually, I put out the fire and crawled into the tent. I lay there listening to the nylon walls shake. The moon was bright enough that its light filtered through the material, giving the tent this dim, silvery glow. Took a while before I felt myself drifting towards sleep. Not long after that, the first sound came. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear. It was just this brief scraping sound somewhere outside. Something dragging lightly along the dirt or against a rock. I didn't move at first. I convinced myself it was a branch or a small animal. But then it came again, a slow scratch that lasted longer this time. I could feel the tiny hairs on my arms rising because it didn't sound random. It sounded like something making its way across the ground with intention, like someone or something moving carefully so as not to be noticed. I stayed still, breathing shallow, hoping it would fade. The wind blew again, and for a moment everything blended together. I shut my eyes and forced myself to stay calm. But then the footsteps began. Not heavy ones. Not the kind that stomp or even walk normally. These were uneven, like someone shifting their weight wrong, like they were testing the ground before each step. Soft but deliberate. A bit too slow for an animal, but too light for a grown human walking normally. The footsteps circled around the tent in a wide arc. I felt my throat tighten as I listened. My body already knew something was off, even though my brain tried to explain it away. I reached instinctively toward my bag near my sleeping pad where I'd kept a small camping knife. Just the touch of it made me feel a little steadier. I didn't open the tent or make a sound. I just waited. The footsteps stopped behind the tent. Then came the breathing. It wasn't heavy or wheezing. It was steady, controlled, like someone trying to stay quiet but too close for me not to hear it. I felt every muscle in my back lock up. The breathing stayed there for maybe 10 long seconds. Then another sound joined it, a faint shuffle, as if the person or animal was adjusting their stance. Then everything went quiet, so quiet I could hear the blood in my ears. I stayed awake for hours, barely moving, refusing to unzip the tent. My mind kept drifting to the stories I'd heard from people in this region, stories I'd always assumed were exaggerated or symbolic. Things about figures that walked like humans but weren't, things that studied people from just out of sight. I'd never believed any of it. I didn't want to believe any of it now. But fear has a way of stripping away all the excuses you tell yourself. Eventually, sometime near dawn, the sky started to lighten. Not much, just enough to shift the color inside the tent. I took that chance to sit up and listen. Nothing moved outside. The wind had calmed. The whole world sounded empty again. I unzipped the tent very slowly and stepped out, my breath fogging faintly in the early cold. At first glance, everything looked normal. My fire ring was still there. My SUV was parked where I left it. The hills looked the same, but the ground around the back of the tent had marks, strange ones. They didn't look like boot prints. They didn't look like paw prints either. They were smudged shapes, long, dragged, like someone had walked on the very edges of their feet or on limbs that didn't bend the way they should. The dirt was disturbed in a looping path around the tent, wide at first, then tighter the closer it came. I followed the marks with my eyes until they faded into the open land. I didn't waste time after that. I packed everything as fast as I could without running. Several times I stopped because I felt like something was watching me from the low ridges, but every time I looked, there was nothing except desert and shadow. When I finally drove away, I kept glancing in the mirrors. The farther I got from that spot, the more the fear changed into a heavy, lingering unease. It sat in my stomach like a cold stone. I didn't understand what had been out there, but I knew it wasn't a normal animal. It had moved around me with too much intention. It had watched me for too long. It had come too close. I didn't tell anyone when I got home. Not at first. I didn't want people assuming I was frightened by nothing or imagining shapes in the dark. So I tried to settle back into normal life. Work, chores, the dull rhythm of responsibility. But nights became harder. Every uneven sound outside my apartment pulled me back to that tent, to that breathing, to the marks circling around me. I started waking up in the middle of the night, heart rushing, convinced something was standing behind my door. I knew it wasn't logical, but fear doesn't need logic. It just needs memory. Weeks later, after I couldn't ignore the tension anymore, I looked up more information about the area I'd camped in. Most sources were simple: wildlife notes, hiking warnings, temperature charts. But tucked between them were older reports, scattered accounts from travelers and locals describing figures moving strangely at night, shapes that looked human from far away but weren't quite right when seen up close, things that avoided towns and roads but followed campers who went too far into the quiet places. I didn't want to believe any of it. I still don't claim I know what I encountered, but I know what I heard. I know how close it came. I know the marks it left. And sometimes the most reasonable explanation is not the safest one. I haven't gone camping alone since that night. Not in deserts, not in forests, not anywhere isolated. I still love nature, but I keep my distance from places where the land feels empty enough that anything can move without being seen. I learned something that night, something simple but sharp enough to stay with me. You can believe you are alone in wide open land. You can believe nothing is watching you. But the desert has a way of hiding things that move like you, sound like you, and know how to get close without making a mistake. And if one of those things decides to stand outside your tent, listening to your breathing through thin nylon walls, you will understand a kind of fear that doesn't fade when the sun comes up. I left that campsite as soon as light reached the ground, and I never returned. I don't need to. Some experiences are clear enough the first time. Some things follow you only once, and that was enough for me.